The Battle of Stamford Bridge was one of the most significant and dramatic battles in English history. It marked the end of the Viking Age in England and set the stage for the Norman conquest. The clash between King Harold Godwinson of England and King Harald Hardrada of Norway, along with the traitorous Tostig Godwinson, was a brutal and decisive encounter that changed the fate of the English throne. This battle, fought on September 25, 1066, was a direct consequence of competing claims to the English crown following the death of Edward the Confessor in January 1066. Harold Godwinson had seized the throne, but he faced two powerful challengers: Harald Hardrada, the warrior king of Norway, and William, Duke of Normandy. Before Harold could deal with William, he had to face the immediate and deadly threat from the Vikings, who had invaded England's north. The battle that followed was a legendary feat of endurance, strategy, and ferocity. It would test the resilience of the Anglo-Saxon army and ultimately cost thousands of lives. In early 1066, England was a divided and vulnerable kingdom. Although Harold Godwinson had been crowned king, his rule was far from secure. His two main enemies, Harald Hardrada and William of Normandy, both believed they had legitimate claims to the throne. Harald Hardrada, whose name means hard ruler, was a seasoned warrior with a fearsome reputation. He was the king of Norway and had spent his early years as a mercenary, fighting across Europe and the Middle East. Harold's claim to the English throne was rooted in an alleged deal between King Harthacnut of England and King Magnus I of Norway, who was Harold's predecessor. Around 1038, Harthacnut, who was childless, supposedly made a pact with Magnus I. If either died without an heir, the other would inherit both kingdoms. Harthacnut died in 1042, and Edward the Confessor took the English throne, ignoring the agreement. Harold believed that, since Magnus had a claim, and Harold inherited Magnus's throne, he inherited the claim to England too. Then there is William. William of Normandy, a powerful and ambitious duke, claimed that Edward the Confessor had promised him the throne years before. He also insisted that Harold Godwinson had sworn an oath of loyalty to him, a claim Harold denied. Meanwhile, Harold Godwinson's own brother, Tostig Godwinson, had been exiled from England and harbored a deep grudge against his brother. Tostig sought revenge and found an ally in Harald Hardrada, convincing the Norwegian king to launch an invasion on England. Together, Tostig and Hardrada assembled a fleet of over 300 longships, carrying around 10,000 battle-hardened Norse warriors. Their goal? To capture England and place Hardrada on the throne. In September 1066, Hardrada and Tostig landed in Yorkshire and began their conquest of northern England. They sailed up the River Humber and swiftly overran several coastal settlements before marching inland. On September 20th, 1066, just outside the city of York, the Norsemen clashed with an English force led by Earls Edwin and Morcar at the Battle of Fulford. The battle was a disaster for the English. The Norse warriors, superior in tactics and experience, crushed the Anglo-Saxon defenders. York soon surrendered to the invaders, giving Hardrada control over the north of England. Buoyed by their victory, the Norsemen set up camp at Stamford Bridge, a small crossing over the River Derwent. Here, they expected to negotiate the terms of the northern lord's submission. They did not anticipate a counterattack. Harold Godwinson, stationed in southern England and preparing for a potential Norman invasion, was caught off guard by the Viking attack. Upon hearing the news of Fulford, he reacted with astonishing speed. With an army of around 15,000 men, Harold embarked on one of the most grueling forced marches in military history. He and his soldiers covered roughly 300 kilometers, or 185 miles, in just 4 days, traveling from London to Yorkshire at an almost impossible pace. By the morning of September 25th, Harold Godwinson and his men arrived near Stamford Bridge. The Vikings had no idea they were coming. On the morning of September 25th, 1066, the Vikings were completely unprepared for battle. Many of them had left their armor behind on their ships, believing they had already won control over the region. Some were even basking in the rare English sunshine when scouts suddenly spotted Harold's army approaching. Hardrada and Tostig were stunned. They had underestimated Harold's speed. With no time to fully prepare, the Viking forces scrambled to form a defensive line on the eastern side of the River Derwent, using Stamford Bridge as a key defensive point. According to legend, before the main battle began, a single giant Norse warrior, armed with a massive Dane axe, held the bridge against Harold's entire army. He cut down dozens of English soldiers, buying his comrades time to organize. The English could not pass until one clever soldier floated beneath the bridge in a barrel and thrust a spear upward, killing the Viking from below. With the bridge cleared, Harold's forces surged forward. With the English now across the river, the real battle began. The Vikings quickly formed a shield wall, a traditional Norse defensive formation. Their warriors locked their shields together in a tight formation, using their axes, spears, and swords to repel attacks. Harald Hardrada himself led from the front. Despite being outnumbered, the Norsemen fought with incredible ferocity, cutting down waves of English attackers. However, the English army had better armor and weapons, and over time, they began to break through the Viking lines. The intense melee saw thousands of men cut down on both sides, with the field turning into a blood-soaked wasteland. During the battle, Harald Hardrada was struck in the throat by an arrow and fell dead. His loss was devastating to the Norse troops, but Tostig refused to surrender. Harold Godwinson offered Tostig peace, promising to spare him if he laid down his arms. But Tostig rejected the offer, rallying the remaining Norse warriors for one final stand. Soon after, Viking reinforcements under Eystein Ori, Hardrada's son-in-law, arrived. But these fresh troops were exhausted from their forced march. They launched a final, desperate attack, known as the Ori Storm, but they were quickly overwhelmed. By the end of the day, the battlefield was littered with thousands of Norse corpses. Of the 10,000 Vikings who had arrived in England, fewer than 3,000 survived. And by the Anglo-Saxons, of the 15,000 Anglo-Saxon warriors, more than 10,000 survived, which means that the Norse had lost 7,000 men, while the Anglo-Saxons lost around 5,000 men. Hardrada's son, Olaf, was allowed to return home with the remnants of the fleet, but only 24 ships remained from the original 300. The defeat at Stamford Bridge ended Viking ambitions in England forever. It was the last great Viking battle on English soil. However, Harold Godwinson had no time to celebrate. Just 3 days later, he received urgent news. William of Normandy had landed on the southern coast. Despite being exhausted from Stamford Bridge, Harold immediately marched his army south to face this new threat. Less than 3 weeks later, he would fight the Battle of Hastings, where fate would finally catch up with him. In this battle, he would die at the hands of William the Conqueror. The Battle of Stamford Bridge was a heroic victory for the English, but also a tragedy for Harold Godwinson. By defeating the Vikings, he had saved his kingdom, only to leave it vulnerable to the Normans. Had Stamford Bridge never happened, Harold might have won at Hastings and changed the course of history forever. Instead, just weeks later, he would die at the hands of William the Conqueror, ushering in the Norman era. Thus, the battle was not just the end of the Vikings, it was the beginning of the end for Anglo-Saxon England itself.